You're listening to A Radio.
Thank you for joining us. You're listening to A Radio, and this is The Morning Moment. Follow us on Spreaker.com and click on the like button. You can find us on most social media platforms such as iTunes, Spotify, and iHeartRadio. Go to our website, aradio.wordpress.com, for details, where you'll find more content and details on our podcasts and more. My story was going to be a different one, but this morning, Tuesday, May 19, I happened to tune into BBC News, the news channel here in Canada. What I was presented with was nothing more and nothing less than pure propaganda. It was unbelievable. What I'm going to play for you is a portion of the piece. You can go right now to BBC News website and look it up yourself. The piece is called The Lost 6 Weeks When US Failed to Contain Virus. That's what it's called. You can listen to it and watch the whole piece. And all I can say is, if this is all you see, this must be the view you get of America and of President Trump. And then no wonder you think the way you do. Goebbels couldn't have done a better job of distorting the truth. And it's no wonder President Trump has such disdain for the mainstream media. If all they are spewing out is crap and lies like this every day, and in the case of the UK taxpayers' expense, it's no wonder they are labelled left-wing. Can you imagine where Britain would be today if they had distorted the truth about the Nazis to this extent? And you haven't even heard it yet.
As the world tries to find an end to the lockdowns, it's important to go back to the beginning. President Trump did take steps to keep the virus out.
When I learned about the gravity of it was sometime just prior to closing the country to China.
But there were holes in his travel bans, and it took 6 weeks before he ended travel from Europe, the other hotspot.
It's going to disappear. One day it's like a miracle. It will disappear.
During this time, the virus spread largely undetected within America's borders. Why wasn't more done to stop it? Let's start by looking at the big picture. The main strategy for mitigating spread has been to lock down communities. China did it in Wuhan and then the whole of Hubei province. Then we saw Italy. They did it in the north and soon the whole of the country. Some have compared response times in relation to first cases or first deaths. But to factor in population size, we actually want to find the date when a country had 1 death per million residents due to COVID-19. And those points were reached at different times in various countries. We can compare how quickly countries reacted by putting those dates as day 1 on a timeline. Germany, France, and the UK locked down within days, learning their lessons from Italy, which took 6 days to lock down the entire country. The US, however, still hasn't declared a national lockdown, more than 45 days later.
If you look at what's going on in this country, I just don't understand why we're not doing that. We really should be.
So why didn't the US act sooner? In the end, most states did issue stay-at-home orders, covering 92% of the U.S. population. But as this chart shows, some states took action much faster than others. We'll look at that in more detail in a moment. There are practical reasons for the different approaches. It's a big country, with some places hit much harder by the outbreak than others. Plus, power is not as centralized in the US, so a national lockdown is not as easy to do. But the main reason why the US missed an opportunity to get ahead of the virus was a lack of information on how bad the outbreak really was. On January 20th and 21st, South Korea and the US confirmed their first case.
We have it totally under control. It's one person coming in from China, and we have it under control. It's going to be just fine.
4 days later, the CDC had developed a test kit and saw FDA approval, while South Korea was already shipping its kits to labs across the country. 12 days after that, the CDC finally followed suit, while South Korea was already developing a faster test and deploying that.
Looks like by April, in theory, when it gets a little warmer, it miraculously goes away. I hope that's true.
2 days later, the CDC acknowledged that its tests were flawed, and labs had to send results back to Atlanta.
When you have 15 people, and the 15 within a couple of days is going to be down to close to zero, that's a pretty good job we've done.
By late February, merely 3 of the more than 100 public labs had a working CDC test.
They're there. They have the test. And the tests are beautiful. Anybody that needs a test gets a test.
By early March, and 6 weeks since the first case was detected, just 3,000 Americans had been tested, 1 in 100,000 residents, compared to 342 in South Korea.
I call it the unseen enemy. You call it, there's 1,000 different terms for it, but whatever, it snuck up on us.
In mid-March, the U.S. had tested 31 people per 100,000 residents. And while the U.S. caught up and surpassed South Korea's rate of testing on April 15th, those initial delays, combined with the message coming from the president, had serious consequences for the U.S. response.
Not only that, it clearly omits the facts of how the United States operates. The states are, for the most part, as we know, independent bodies. They operate almost like separate countries, viewed from the outside perspective, with such freedoms as different tax strategies and governments. Not only that, Congress at the time was fighting with the president every step of the way, every step he took, every action he took to keep Americans safe, to the extent that the leader of the House of Representatives at the time, Nancy Pelosi, was wandering around Chinatown in San Francisco saying there was no problem, carry on as before, and that was in late February. No mention of that in this piece. The mayor of New York City, which is the epicenter of the pandemic in the United States, continued on for weeks before he was forced to close down the 9 boroughs. This piece of so-called journalism ignores basic facts such as China lied and kept key information from the world, causing the worldwide pandemic that could have in all likelihood have been kept contained. Nowhere in this piece is that fact ever conveyed, and nowhere was it explained how woefully inadequate were the supplies in the US that the president was presented with. The most heinous part of the reporting, as far as I'm concerned, or lack thereof, was the complete omission that the federal government set up a coronavirus task force, set up by President Trump and coordinated by the vice president. One of the many tasks it was set was the lack of PPE and ventilators, so they set about dealing with these issues to great success, despite the fact that the Communist Party of China have already bought up most of the world's stock of PPE prior to advising the world of the virus. This was also never mentioned. Never. The president put together a government-private partnership to produce equipment needed and to manufacture it. At the same time, they devised and put into action a national testing strategy where one did not exist previously. How can you blame him for that? They do. Finally, they decided, after being advised by medical experts, that South Korea's testing was flawed, giving too many false positives. So they decided to come up with their own test, and they did so. at record speed. None of that was mentioned in the video. None of it. All the time, the president was still battling party politics and, by the way, fake impeachment by the Democrats. None of this was even talked about in background. None of it. This, to me, is probably the most biased piece of reporting I have ever seen. But you be the judge. And by the way, we haven't even covered how the UK and Europe compares, and they certainly don't come out looking as good either. Rather exposes the social medicine with all its flaws. And that includes Socialist Trudeau state of Canada. And that's my comment. You can find more at aradio.wordpress.com, where you can find links to us on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, iTunes, iHeartRadio, Gab, Spotify, and email. We're on Spotify under the podcast section. Type in Canadian Politics with a twist and you'll find us. We are continuing to reach out to you, so please pass these links on to your friends. Please click on the follow button on Spreaker.com. You can listen to all our morning moments at Spreaker.com/A-Radio. EHRADIO, A-Radio. And please click on the like button. Join us Monday, Wednesday and Friday at 11:45 Eastern. And tell your friends and pass the word. We only tell the truth, not what the mainstream media want you to know.